In the final days of May 1945, as Germany signed its unconditional surrender and the guns fell silent across Europe, the Allied navies faced a problem that no one had fully anticipated. Scattered across the ports of the defeated Reich, from the Baltic coast to the fjords of Norway, lay the largest fleet of submarines ever assembled in human history. 156 operational U-boats remained intact, their crews awaiting orders that would never come, their weapons still loaded, their engines still capable of diving into the depths. The war was over, but the question of what to do with these instruments of terror had only just begun. The U-boat had been Germany's most devastating weapon, the one system that had genuinely threatened to defeat the Allied cause. For nearly 6 years, submarines flying the Nazi ensign had prowled the Atlantic, sinking over 14 million tons of Allied shipping and killing more than 30,000 merchant sailors. They had brought Britain to the edge of starvation, had forced the diversion of enormous resources to anti-submarine warfare, had delayed the invasion of Europe by making the build-up of forces a matter of life and death rather than mere logistics. Even in defeat, the U-boat fleet represented a strategic asset of immense value, or an equally immense danger, depending on who controlled it. The Allied powers, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, each had different ideas about what should happen to the surrendered submarines. The Soviets, their own submarine force relatively primitive by German standards, were eager to acquire as many U-boats as possible for study and potential service. The Americans, already possessing the world's largest navy, were less interested in the submarines themselves than in the technology they contained, particularly the advanced Type 21 boats that represented the cutting edge of underwater warfare. The British, who had borne the brunt of the U-boat campaign and lost the most to it, wanted something simpler. They wanted the submarines destroyed. The disagreement reflected deeper tensions within the wartime alliance, tensions that would soon harden into the Cold War. The Soviets suspected, correctly, that their Western allies were already planning for a future in which the Soviet Union might be the enemy rather than the partner. The Americans and British suspected, equally correctly, that Stalin intended to use captured German technology to strengthen his military position in Europe and beyond. The fate of the U-boat fleet became one of many points of friction in a relationship that was rapidly deteriorating. The initial agreement, hammered out at the Potsdam Conference in July and August 1945, called for the submarines to be divided among the 3 major powers, with 10 boats going to each nation for technical evaluation. The remainder, well over 100 submarines, were to be destroyed. The British, given their experience with German naval forces after the First World War, were designated to carry out the destruction. They approached the task with characteristic thoroughness, planning an operation that would eliminate the U-boat threat permanently and prevent any possibility of the submarines falling into hostile hands. The operation was codenamed Deadlight, a term borrowed from the nautical vocabulary where it refers to a thick glass porthole that cannot be opened. The name was grimly appropriate. The U-boats would be sealed, towed to deep water, and sent to the bottom, their hatches welded shut, their future foreclosed forever. The location selected was the Atlantic northwest of Ireland, where depths exceeding 100 meters would ensure that the submarines could never be raised or salvaged. Between November 1945 and February 1946, 116 U-boats would make their final voyage to this watery graveyard. The logistics of Operation Deadlight were formidable. The surrendered submarines were scattered across multiple ports, many in poor condition after years of hard service and months of neglect following the surrender. Some had been sabotaged by their crews in the final days, their instruments smashed, their engines disabled, their records destroyed. Others had been maintained in operational condition by Germans who hoped, against all evidence, that the political situation might somehow change in their favor. All of them needed to be assessed, prepared for sea, and towed to the scuttling grounds, a task that would occupy thousands of British sailors and consume months of effort. The process began with the concentration of the submarines at designated collection points. Loch Ryan in Scotland and Lisahally in Northern Ireland became the primary assembly areas, their waters crowded with the grey hulls of the defeated fleet. British naval personnel, many of whom had spent the war hunting these same submarines, now found themselves responsible for their care and transport. The irony was not lost on anyone. Men who had celebrated every U-boat sinking now walked the decks of the enemy, inspecting compartments where German sailors had lived and died, examining the weapons that had killed their comrades. The condition of the submarines varied enormously. Some, particularly the newer Type 21 boats, were engineering marvels that impressed even their captors. These were true submarines, designed to operate primarily underwater rather than as surface vessels that could submerge when threatened. Their streamlined hulls, powerful electric motors, and revolutionary snorkel systems represented capabilities that Allied navies would spend years trying to match. The Americans were particularly interested in these boats, and several were exempted from Deadlight for detailed technical evaluation. 2 would eventually be taken to the United States, where they would influence the design of the post-war American submarine fleet. Other boats were barely seaworthy, their hulls corroded, their machinery worn out, their interiors stripped of anything valuable by crews who knew the end was coming. These submarines posed the greatest challenge for the Deadlight planners. Towing a submarine across open ocean was dangerous under the best circumstances. Towing a hulk that might flood or break apart at any moment was exponentially more so. Several boats sank during the transit to the scuttling grounds, unable to survive the journey that was meant to end with their deliberate destruction. The human dimension of Operation Deadlight was complex and often uncomfortable. German submarine crews, the survivors of a force that had lost over 30,000 men during the war, watched as their boats were prepared for destruction. Some had served aboard these submarines for years, had survived depth charge attacks and aircraft assaults, had seen friends die in the steel coffins that U-boats became when things went wrong. Their emotional attachment to their vessels was real, however much the Allied victors might have preferred to ignore it. The submarines were not just weapons, they were homes, communities, the settings for experiences that would haunt their crews forever. The Allied personnel assigned to Deadlight faced their own psychological challenges. Many had lost friends and family to U-boat attacks. The Merchant Navy, which had suffered catastrophic casualties throughout the war, was particularly well represented among the civilian sailors assisting with the operation. These men had spent years fearing the submarines they now handled, had watched shipmates drown in the aftermath of torpedo strikes, had survived in lifeboats while U-boats circled nearby. Now they were expected to treat the enemy's weapons with professional detachment, to prepare them carefully for a destruction that must have seemed entirely too clinical for the crimes they represented. The scuttling itself was carried out with military precision. Submarines were towed in groups to the designated coordinates, their positions carefully recorded for future reference. British warships, primarily frigates and destroyers, stood by to complete the destruction if the boats failed to sink on their own. The method varied depending on the condition of the submarine. Some were flooded through their torpedo tubes or deck hatches, the sea allowed to claim them gradually as they settled lower and lower in the water. Others required more direct intervention, gunfire, depth charges, or demolition charges placed by boarding parties. The spectacle of a U-boat sinking, even a controlled sinking, was grimly memorable for those who witnessed it. These were substantial vessels, over 60 meters long in most cases, their hulls designed to withstand enormous pressure at depth. Watching them die was like watching the death of a living thing, a slow surrender to forces they had been built to resist. They would list, settle, sometimes rear up at the bow or stern before sliding under, their final moments captured in photographs and film footage that would later become historical documents. The waters of the Atlantic accepted them without ceremony, swallowing the instruments of so much death into darkness that would preserve them for generations. The process was not without incident. Weather in the North Atlantic during the winter months was predictably terrible, with storms that made towing operations dangerous and sometimes impossible. Several submarines broke free from their tows in heavy seas, drifting until they could be recovered or sank on their own. Others developed leaks during transit, requiring emergency interventions to keep them afloat long enough to reach the scuttling grounds. The irony of working desperately to save a submarine that was scheduled for destruction anyway was noted by more than one participant. Casualties among the Allied personnel were mercifully light, but the operation was not entirely without cost. The physical demands of handling submarines in winter conditions led to injuries and illnesses. The emotional toll of the work, confronting the enemy's weapons while processing the war's end, affected men in ways that were not always visible. For some, Deadlight provided closure, a definitive end to a conflict that had consumed years of their lives. For others, it raised questions that would never be fully answered about the nature of the enemy, the meaning of victory, the proper way to dispose of the instruments of mass death. The Soviet reaction to Operation Deadlight was predictable and vociferous. Stalin's representatives protested that the destruction of the submarines violated the spirit of Allied cooperation, that the technology being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic should have been shared more equitably among the victorious powers. The Soviets had received their allocated 10 submarines, including examples of the advanced Type 21, but they wanted more. The British refusal to accommodate these demands was one of many points of friction that contributed to the rapid breakdown of the wartime alliance. In retrospect, the Soviet complaints had some merit. The Type 21 U-boat was genuinely revolutionary, a submarine that could have changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic had it been deployed earlier and in greater numbers. Its design principles, streamlined hull, high-capacity batteries, snorkel system for extended underwater operation, would dominate submarine development for the next 2 decades. The Americans and British both benefited enormously from studying captured examples. The Soviets, denied equal access, would spend years developing equivalent capabilities through their own efforts. The asymmetry contributed to the naval arms race that characterized the Cold War. The British decision to destroy rather than redistribute the U-boat fleet was driven by multiple considerations, not all of them openly acknowledged. The official justification emphasized the danger of allowing so many advanced weapons to fall into potentially hostile hands. The submarines were destroyed, the argument went, because they were too dangerous to preserve. But underlying this reasoning was a deeper motivation, the desire to ensure that Britain's wartime sacrifice would not be rendered meaningless by the post-war survival of the weapons that had caused so much suffering. The Royal Navy had lost over 50,000 men during the Battle of the Atlantic, including both naval personnel and the merchant sailors who kept Britain supplied. The U-boats had killed more British servicemen than any other German weapon system. They had sunk ships within sight of the British coast, had landed spies on British beaches, had maintained a threat that shaped every aspect of British war planning from 1939 to 1945. For the men who had fought this battle, the idea of allowing the U-boats to survive was emotionally intolerable, regardless of what strategic logic might have suggested. Operation Deadlight was also a statement about the nature of unconditional surrender. Germany had not negotiated the end of the war. It had been comprehensively defeated, its military forces destroyed or captured, its territory occupied, its government dissolved. The destruction of the U-boat fleet was a visible demonstration of this reality, proof that the Allied victory was complete and permanent. The submarines that had terrorized the Atlantic for 6 years would never sail again. Their threat had been ended not through negotiation, but through annihilation. The legal framework surrounding Deadlight reflected the unprecedented nature of the post-war settlement. Unlike previous conflicts, where defeated navies might be interned or transferred, the Second World War ended with the complete dismantlement of German military power. The submarines were not captured prizes in the traditional sense. They were instruments of a regime that had been declared criminal, weapons of a state that had ceased to exist. Their destruction was less an act of war than an act of judicial execution, the elimination of tools that could serve no legitimate purpose in the post-war world. The submarine crews who watched Deadlight unfold experienced a particular form of defeat. Many had believed, genuinely and fervently, that they were fighting for their nation's survival. The propaganda that had sustained them through years of increasingly desperate combat had portrayed the U-boat war as heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. Now they saw their boats towed to destruction by the enemies they had failed to defeat, their efforts rendered meaningless by the totality of Germany's collapse. The psychological impact of this experience contributed to the complex relationship that post-war Germans would have with their wartime service. Some former U-boat men went on to serve in the new West German Navy, established in 1956 as part of NATO's defense against the Soviet threat. These veterans brought their experience to a service that would eventually operate submarines again, though under very different circumstances and for very different purposes. The knowledge they had gained about submarine operations, about the psychology of underwater warfare, about the technical demands of the service, proved valuable to their new masters, even as the specific boats they had served on rusted on the ocean floor. The physical remains of Operation Deadlight lie scattered across a wide area of the Atlantic, their exact positions known only approximately. Sonar surveys and occasional diving expeditions have located some of the wrecks, their hulls still recognizable after decades underwater. These submarines have become artificial reefs, colonized by marine life that knows nothing of the purpose for which they were built. Fish swim through compartments where men once lived. Coral grows on torpedo tubes that once launched weapons of destruction. The ocean has reclaimed them, transformed them from instruments of war into components of an ecosystem. For historians, the Deadlight submarines represent a lost archive as much as a collection of wrecks. The boats sent to the bottom carried with them whatever records and equipment had not been removed during the preparation process. Some contained personal effects of crew members, letters and photographs that would have illuminated the human experience of the U-boat war. Others held technical documentation that might have revealed details about German submarine development that remain unknown. The decision to sink rather than preserve these vessels, however justified at the time, eliminated resources that later researchers would have valued highly. The strategic consequences of Deadlight extended beyond the immediate post-war period. By eliminating the bulk of the German submarine fleet, the Allies ensured that no future German navy could quickly reconstitute an underwater threat. This consideration was not merely theoretical. The experience of the 1930s, when Germany had rapidly rebuilt its military in violation of the Versailles Treaty, remained fresh in Allied memories. The submarines destroyed during Deadlight could not be hidden, could not be secretly maintained, could not be rapidly returned to service if German nationalism revived. Their elimination was permanent in a way that treaty provisions could never be. The operation also established precedents for the disposal of weapons of mass destruction that would influence subsequent arms control efforts. The idea that certain weapons were too dangerous to be allowed to exist, that their elimination served the interest of all nations, would recur in debates over nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons throughout the Cold War and beyond. Deadlight was not the first such destruction. The scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet at Scapa Flow in 1919 provided an earlier example, but it was among the most systematic, a deliberate campaign to eliminate an entire category of military capability. The memory of Operation Deadlight faded quickly from public consciousness. The immediate post-war years were consumed by more pressing concerns: the occupation of Germany, the Nuremberg trials, the emerging Cold War, the reconstruction of devastated economies. The submarines rusting on the Atlantic floor were yesterday's threat, superseded by new dangers that demanded attention. Only historians and naval enthusiasts maintained interest in the operation, studying its execution and debating its implications while the general public moved on. Yet the significance of Deadlight endures. It marked the end of the most destructive submarine campaign in history, the final chapter of a battle that had shaped the entire course of the Second World War. It demonstrated the determination of the victorious powers to ensure that their victory would be permanent, that the weapons which had caused so much suffering would never threaten again. And it created a submarine graveyard in the Atlantic depths, a monument to the destructive potential of underwater warfare that lies silent and unseen beneath the waves. 116 U-boats made their final dives during Operation Deadlight. They joined the hundreds of others that had been sunk during the war itself, the boats destroyed by depth charges and aircraft, by mines and accidents, by the relentless pressure of Allied anti-submarine warfare. Together, they represent the largest concentration of submarine wrecks anywhere in the world, a fleet of the dead that will never sail again. The ocean keeps them now, preserving their steel hulls in the cold darkness where no sunlight penetrates, where the only movement is the slow drift of currents and the patient work of corrosion. For the men who served on these submarines, on both sides of the conflict, Deadlight was an ending and a beginning. It closed the chapter of the U-boat war definitively, removing any possibility that the struggle might somehow resume. But it also opened questions about memory and meaning that would persist for generations. What did it mean to have fought in submarines that now lay destroyed on the ocean floor? What value could be assigned to sacrifice that had ended in such complete defeat? How should the dead be remembered, the 30,000 German submariners who never returned from patrol, the tens of thousands of Allied sailors who died when their ships were torpedoed? These questions have no easy answers, and perhaps no answers at all. Operation Deadlight did not resolve them. It merely ensured that they would be asked in the past tense about a threat that had been eliminated rather than one that persisted. The submarines are gone, their crews scattered to death or old age, their war receding further into history with each passing year, but the Atlantic remembers. Somewhere off the Irish coast, in waters too deep for casual exploration, the grey hulls of the Deadlight fleet rest in rows like soldiers in a cemetery, their hatches sealed, their secrets kept, their stories waiting for anyone patient enough to listen. The final boat sank on February 11, 1946, 9 months after Germany's surrender. When it slipped beneath the waves, the era of the Nazi U-boat ended forever. What remained was memory, controversy, and 116 wrecks that would slowly become part of the ocean itself. Operation Deadlight had accomplished its purpose. The wolf packs would hunt no more.